Welcome back to the Curdverse. I'm Lisa Kaywood, corporate functionary by day, home cheesemaker by night. In the last episode on stretched curd cheeses, and in episode 16 on fresh cheeses, I began diving into Asian forms of cheesemaking. Cheese and dairying began, as best as we can tell, in Center-West Asia in the late Neolithic era, and spread east as readily as it did west. But Asian forms of cheesemaking are quite different from the damp-aged versions of cheese we know from Europe, for reasons of climate, topography, lifestyle, and also religion. Animal rennet traditionally is not used in most of Asia. More often than not, the milk is heated to pasteurization temperatures in the course of making the cheese, and all indications are that this has been true for thousands of years. Often the milk is quickly acidified with added acids such as lemon juice rather than slowly fermented. The role that dairy plays in the cultures and cuisines of Asia also tends to be quite different from those of Europe. Today, we get to hear about the cheese and dairy products in pre-modern China in this special interview with Dr. Miranda Brown. Dairying has a very long history in China, and in fact, some of the oldest actual pieces of cheese we found anywhere in the world, some 3,600 years old, comes from the desert region of the Tarim Basin in what is now northwest China. In this interview, Dr. Brown tells us mostly about the historical periods of Chinese history from the Han Dynasty onwards. For those not familiar with Chinese dynasties, there's a timeline in the show notes, as well as links to Dr. Brown's food research. Miranda, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you.
So Miranda, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? I believe you're a professor of Chinese history at University of Michigan, but you focus mostly on food history. Tell us a little bit about how you got there.
It's in a circuitous route. So I'm actually trained as a classical historian. I'm in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, and I got interested in sort of the history of dairy in China because I found a reference to it in a 2,000-year-old medical text for camel butter. And I thought, what is that? And, can you make butter from camel milk? And what is it doing in a Chinese context? Because I was under the impression that, Chinese, at least historically, didn't do dairy. My mother, who was Chinese herself, actually used to talk about the world of the Chinese tofu on the one hand, and then you have the West, which are full of butter eaters. And so by implication, that sort of suggested that there was no butter in China. So that's kind of that was one of my ends. I also teach a class on the history of food and drink in Asia. It's something that I've become very interested in, especially, after I had my 7-year-old. So this is sort of a more recent interest of mine, and I've, sort of been interested in all aspects of Chinese food history.
Cool. So let's start with that camel butter, 2,000-year-old camel butter. Where was the text from? You said it was a medical text.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that these camels were probably somewhere in the Northwest, or was it were they more widespread than that?
Camels were, all through the north. I mean, we have footage from the turn of the century with camels moving through Beijing. So, but so even relatively recently, there were camels, where we now would have, enormous apartment blocks and sort of BMWs. But this particular text was in Gansu in the Northwest. It's in the site called Juyan. It was a site called Wuwei. It's a small city now-ish. It's small in the Chinese context. It's not small in any other context. But it was sort of a recipe for dealing with wounds on your backside from riding horses. So you mix up some camel butter, probably Bactrian camel milk, which is richer than most camel milk. And then you turn it into a paste and add Sichuan peppercorns, and that should take the ouch out of things.
I don't know. If you've got a raw wound and you're putting peppercorns on it, it doesn't sound very comfortable.
It's numbing. It's numbing. So numbing and soothing, I guess. I'm assuming those two work against, work in a complementary fashion.
So, so are most of the texts then, most of the early references, are they medical, or are there kind of food things kind of mixed in there?
Definitely food things. I mean, we know people are drinking horse milk at court, that there's a bureau that's involved at least from about 130 BC. The emperor has somebody who's in charge of producing, fermented horse milk, with a little bit of a buzz for him and sort of the big officials at court, and it becomes sort of fashionable with the ruling and mercantile elite, in the first century, BC, or which is of course the heyday of the Silk Road, or the early heyday of the Silk Road. Um, and then, there are just references to other sort of kinds of dairy products. They trickle in sort of sources. We have gorgeous representations of people trying to milk all sorts of animals, horses, sheep, donkeys, cows, and then drinking the milk, more or less straight from the udder, or after it's been put into a cup. And those depictions date to about 150 AD. The picture is great because it shows a sort of a man getting kicked as he's trying to milk a horse. It's a highly dangerous thing to do. I wouldn't recommend trying it.
At least not if you're not very familiar with the horse. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, when do you start seeing things like curds and what we might think of as cheese?
There's a tricky question. I mean, there are descriptions in like a first century poem about, Han soldiers finding the sort of the Mongolian stash. These are not exactly Mongols, but they're Mongolian peoples, in sort of today's Inner Mongolia. They find their stash of like dried yogurt, which is kind of sometimes referred to as a cheese, and then burning it. But that is something that dried yogurt cheese becomes something, I think, quite common in the diet, at least by the 6th century. In North China, places like Shandong, people are using excess, surplus milk to make curd that they can preserve for wintertime or for, famines. And it apparently makes everything taste better, is what they said.
A little more piquant. So, different regions use dairy differently in their diet. Um, in places where the food tends to be quite spicy or highly flavored, for example, dairy is kind of like it's the counterbalance. It's the cooling thing, and in modern Europe, where the food is quite bland, it's the more pungent, stinky thing. Where and how did dairy fall in the traditional Chinese diet?
Oh, I think it changes over time, but definitely early on, you're getting the more pungent flavors of goat milk, and it's been turned into yogurt and aged and then
Mm.
preserved. So it can be a little musky, and that's used definitely with cow's milk, when that's available. I think it's also a source of sour. I think, acid is really important in ancient diets because, you don't have a lot of sugar, you don't have our spices, you don't necessarily have a ton of salt. So these, preserved yogurts become flavoring agents. I mean, they describe, putting that into hot water to drink. And so I'm thinking of like a very sour yogurt, kind of beverage. Also putting it into stews, into grains to flavor them, to add also some more protein, obviously. Our vocabulary, not theirs. So I think it's important because, I think, something that people don't realize is that traditional Chinese cooking, thousands of years ago was probably quite sour. And that's a common sort of taste profile around the world, actually.
Yeah.
Many places before sugar.
Well, yeah, I mean, just having more fermented foods in the diet was very common before refrigeration, because how else were you going to preserve things? What are some of the things that I guess what were some of the things that were most surprising to you in your research?
Um, well, I mean, sort of the valorization of dairy. It's not sort of at in the mid sixth century. It's not necessarily a luxury food, but if you go 1,000 years or 500 years forward, it becomes sort of a luxury food, and Chinese use it as sort of a poetic trope to describe things that are very sensual and rich and pleasurable. So that's something I find very, very surprising is I was under the impression that Chinese hate dairy, growing up. And then I find out that, everything is being compared to milk, or butter. Women, great food, the texture of pastry, of meat, the fragrance of milk. I found that all surprising. So that was probably one of the biggest surprises.
That all maps very closely to a lot of things like in the way that milk is referred to in Mongolian culture. But in Mongolian culture, it also has kind of a spiritual overlay. Does that also exist in ancient Chinese culture?
Um, yes, I mean, there's also, I think, association with Buddhism that becomes quite important in the sort of first half of the first millennium AD. A lot of cow's milk is associated with enlightenment, right? One of the things about the Buddha is that he tries to reach nirvana, and he fasts, or he's too focused on his meditation, and then he's exhausts himself, and then he meets a woman who puts together the milk of 100 cows and boils down this extremely rich milk kanji, which I assume is pretty sweet too. Um, Given that much milk. And then he drinks it, right? So you have depictions of that in like sort of Buddhist monastic art in China. And so monastic food actually emphasizes butter and dairy. One of the interesting things is that there's depictions of how to get to nirvana. That's often sort of analogized to the process of making ghee from raw milk, actually. So there's that spiritual overlay, but it's very specific to this Buddhist
I see.
tradition.
Interesting. So it sounds like just about any kind of animal that one might use for milk got used for milk. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, some more than others, right? I mean, there are medical formulas that suggest using the milk of pigs to treat
Interesting.
alcoholism.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so it's not, I think, very practical to milk a pig. There's apparently many, many teats, and they're not very large. For example, sometimes there are references to milk of dogs. Again, don't see that as particularly sort of useful. But large, slow-moving sort of animals like cows, yaks, various kinds of buffaloes. The ones that have sort of lower yields tend to have richer milk. Those are kind of privileged, I think. Sheep, donkey. Donkey milk is still popular in
Hmm.
China. Kind of a luxury food now, or health food. Camels, for sure. I mean, a wider range of animals than I'm used to seeing at the American
Yeah,
grocery store.
definitely. So you have been doing firsthand observation and experiments. I know with some of the things you've tried. What can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to make a sort of like it's sort of similar to mozzarella, and it's one of those cheeses that you stretch. It was just sort of an ancient formula. You actually see it's an ancient recipe. You see it actually in novels, like the Jing Mei, which is sort of China's most famous sort of pornographic novel. There's descriptions of various dairy products being consumed after things are done in private spaces. But one of the things is this sort of mozzarella-like cheese, which is stretched, and it's made without rennet. You take raw milk, and you have to first make sort of a soft curd, like similar to cottage cheese or paneer, but at a lower temperature than you normally would with paneer. And then after that, you immediately immerse it in hot scalding water, and the thing starts to stretch like a noodle. So I did that one. That was one of my favorite sort of experiments, in part because I tried it at least 10 different times with pasteurized milk in Michigan. And then I went to California for a trip to give a talk, and I know that's one of two states where you can get raw milk at the grocery store. So I went shopping, and after 10 unsuccessful sort of rounds with this recipe, I was really frustrated, but I had a feeling that the raw milk would do the trick. And so I got my raw milk, and, I opened it up and it smelled like it came out of an animal, like much gamier than the milk I'm used to drinking. Um, and, it worked. I mean, I had a cheese within like 3 minutes. It was amazing.
Yeah, stretched curd cheeses like mozzarella are not for the faint of heart under any circumstances. That people often say, "Oh, well, that's a beginner cheese." It's not a beginner cheese. I'm right. I'm here to say,
Oh,
um,
but this one was so easy. I've never done this one is remarkably easy. All you need is vinegar and hot water. And I got it right on the first run. I mean, I was impressed. So I would highly recommend that one as a beginner cheese.
all right, fair enough. Um, so are there things like yogurts, dried curds? You talked about dried yogurt. I mean, I remember in the mid '90s in Beijing, they would sell the little, suanyonai, right? The drinking
I know it's
drinkable
the best
yogurt.
yogurt in the world. It's the best yogurt. It's the best yogurt in the world. I've never gotten over that. And I think they had it in Nanjing actually, probably in the 80s. I've heard from friends. Yeah, yogurt is, it has been, and I've been trying to figure out how far back that particular yogurt goes back in Chinese history. I mean, yogurt's been around, in some form for the last 2,000 years, but whether there's a consistent tradition is something that I've been trying to figure out. I suspect it is because, yogurt wasn't a very popular food in the early 20th century in the Anglo-American world. So I doubt it came from, those guys.
Yeah.
And it is, but it's hard to know. I mean, the documentary trail is a little bit. It's been a little bit hard to trace. There are other things that are easier to trace, like soft curds that are made with rennins, so enzyme activated curd, which are very interesting. So there's two kinds. One is used as a sort of an old ginger, like this is very famous jiang zhuangnai, like ginger hits the milk, and it's basically you have this old ginger, sorry, you get the juice out, then you heat up the milk, you put it in gently, and then it turns into a soft curd with a gingery taste. Traditionally made with buffalo milk, still something you can
Sounds
find
fantastic.
in Hong Kong or in actually mainland China, where you still get it with the swamp buffalo milk. And then there's this palace curd, which has become very popular in China in a variety of cities now. It's actually a reconstructed tradition, which I find really interesting. So if you go to Beijing, there's these different houses that claim to be sixth generation, like curd masters who come from the palace. Always beware, right? Often, some of the families are Chinese Muslims, so Chinese speaking, Chinese looking people who are, Muslim descendants of, most likely converts or people that sort of came to China during the Mongol era. And what they do in these Beijing sort of shops is they heat up milk, usually, or bake it with young Chinese rice wine, where you remove the rice. It's like fermented rice.
Hmm.
So there's an enzyme in it. Like it's like koji.
Hmm.
And then that has an enzyme and it activates with a little bit of heat. And you get this sort of pretty firm curd, firmer than like what we call tofu pudding
Hmm.
or silken tofu, stronger than that.
Okay.
Has a wonderful, like sort of slightly alcoholic flavor to it. Like think sake,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
like
Okay.
sweet sake. And that's, I think, very, very popular now because it's considered a palace cheese. That's a translation. It's actually kind of, and they were like, well, the Manchus or who, were foreign conquerors of China, and they brought it to China, but it's actually not. It's an older product. I've been able to trace it back into the Ming. It actually was quite popular in China, especially in the summer. So it's a very nice product. I would highly recommend anybody who can get their hands on this sort of koji, like this fermented rice. You make it at home in 20 minutes.
Interesting. So it sounds like all the coagulation or coagulants are plant based. Is that right?
So far as I know,
Okay.
um, I have been looking for rennet. I haven't yet found rennet. Um, I found rennins,
Hmm.
enzyme activated things. I found things that are really weird, like the stuff that the sort of what is it called? It's used in tofu making with the salt water residue. I think we call it nigari.
Hmm. This is how I first came across your work was when you were asking about how nigari worked, and I still haven't worked it out because it's so very different chemically from how we do things in Western cheese making.
Well, it's not enzyme, it's not
Yeah,
acid, and
exactly.
it's not rennet, right? So I'm like, or it's not, and it's not, it's not a culture. So I'm like, where does it fall on the spectrum, or is it a new thing?
Because people use it for making tofu. So it's obviously got some sort of coagulant in it. I think it has something to do with the exchange with magnesium ions, but I haven't like sat down and actually like drawn out what that would look like. Um, So cool. I mean, I remember again, when I was living there in the 90s that Sueño and I was the kind of the beginning and the end of dairy of in China, and people were just like, yeah, just like your mom said, like that's a foreign thing. But now, China's the third largest dairy producer in the world after India and the US. And so what are they using all that dairy for?
Yogurt, milk, bubble tea.
Bubble tea.
There's some cheese, a lot of. Well, and this is something that I've thought about, which is that it's gone from being a very sour food to kind of almost a sweet food.
Mm.
Not unlike the U.S. Like, our yogurt is pudding.
Oh, it's disgusting.
I mean, I like sugar like any other person who's earned their pre-diabetic, card. But but ice cream, right? Americans had ice cream. They don't drink as much liquid milk, but they eat a lot of ice cream.
Mm.
Right? I mean, we still eat cheese, and that probably is one of the reasons why our numbers are higher. And
Hmm.
cheese hasn't yet caught on, in the Chinese diet in the same extent. Um,
Mm.
but there are traditional cheeses, like there's the paneer-like cheeses, which used to be very common, and are still, a thing in Southwest China.
You mentioned before when you were talking about the stretch cheese that was also something that was used in Southwest China. Is it the case that using dairy kind of just never really died out there?
Yeah. And I read a newspaper sort of article from the 1920s or 30s, and they were describing the fact that, yeah, they have lots of green hills where the goats can graze. So I think, part of it is like, traditionally grazing happened in the hills, and, some mountains. And the sort of lowlands were reserved for agriculture. Now, what I
Hmm.
think happened with dairy in the southeast, which used to have a fair amount of it, was that the hills got taken up with growing sort of crops like tobacco and sweet potatoes and peanuts and things that the poor, which is always sort of an issue in traditional China, were using the hills to grow that stuff. And so I think largely animal husbandry really sort of started to die out in late imperial China. You know, often if there was a cow in a village, it was shared between families. And if you work a cow to death, she's not going to lactate.
Yeah. So it sounds like dairy was kind of all over the place. Were there regional specialties that you've found, or is it just everybody was just kind of doing whatever they got, whatever they had, they just turned into stuff?
If they had it, yeah. There's I mean, even in the Song Dynasty, let's say ninth to 13th century, there are references to area that are dairy free, and areas that people are going where there's no dairy and there's whining about it. There are also letters about places where you can get a lot of good cheese. It's quite interesting. I mean, so this Northwest was considered like
Mm.
sort of the best place for butters or ghee, clarified butters in the Tang and Song dynasties. So Song dynasty ends. But the southeast, the Shanghai area, actually is a big sort of dairy producing center in late
Interesting.
imperial China. So in the sort of 13th, 14th, 15th century, they get a lot of people from the north who come after an invasion and kind of relocate to the south, and then they try to recreate the dairy culture of the north. They even bring some of the animals that they're using, like sheep, and they try to raise sheep in the sweltering southeast, which is amazing. And that breed still lives on to this day, which is
Interesting.
amazing to me. Um, so that area becomes famous initially for its rich butters, and then later becomes famous for its soft cheeses.
Very cool.
And then there's this area not too far from Hong Kong, which is famous for its like soft curds. It's famous for its like salted cheeses. They have a brine cheese that's made
Hmm.
like paneer, but then sliced, and they have it for breakfast with the rice porridge. Um, so there still are spots, and yeah, like in China, often like a spot will become famous for a
Right.
product.
Um, anything other, just you just like some weird factoid that you just have been dying to share with people.
I don't. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that there being dairy in China is it's like weird
Yeah, I think so.
factoid,
That's true.
right? I mean, I don't want to make a plug for raw milk. That's way too political for me. And I know that there's always some headline or some Twitter feed that be I can't look at anymore. But I do think that if you want to sort of like make the stretch cheese, which I think is simple, I put out a recipe actually. Um, that you can do at home as long as you can get access to raw milk. It's I think it's not it could be a 5 to 10 minute
Interesting.
project.
So, if people want to find your recipe, your blog, find you on social media, where should they go?
Um, well, I'm transitioning to Instagram. My Instagram handle is DONG_MUDA. Or you could find me at ChineseFoodHistory.org.
All right. So, Dongmuda on Instagram and ChineseFoodHistory.org.
Yeah, yeah. I've departed from Twitter.
You and many others. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Next time on the Curdverse, we'll continue exploring cheese in a Chinese context, this time with an interview with artisan cheesemaker Isabella Chen of Taiwan. Isabella focuses on Italian style stretched curd cheeses, but our conversation goes far beyond that. So join me again next time as we once again enter the Curdverse.